28,000 years ago, in a limestone shelter on the heel of Italy's boot, someone knelt beside a dying woman and began threading shells. Not just a handful, over 600 of them, small sea snails, each one pierced with a stone tool, one at a time, then strung together into a cap that would cover her skull like a crown. Red ochre was rubbed into her hair and her bones until everything took on the color of blood and fire. Someone folded her arm gently across her belly, a final protective gesture toward the child she never delivered. She was 20 years old. She was in her 8th month of pregnancy, and in that cold cave, by torchlight, with the smell of tallow and turned earth in the air, an entire community stopped what it was doing to grieve her. That woman has a name now. Archaeologists call her Delia, and she's about to answer one of the strangest questions in all of human evolution. Here's the question. How did our species survive childbirth for hundreds of thousands of years with no hospitals, no antibiotics, no surgeons, no epidurals, when human birth is, biologically speaking, one of the most dangerous things a mammal can do? Think about that for a second. A house cat gives birth alone in a closet and walks away 20 minutes later like nothing happened. Human birth is not like that. It never has been. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why, and you'll meet the ancient tools, the ancient tricks, and the ancient people who made it possible for you to be watching this right now. Because somebody, going back further than written language, further than agriculture, further than fire in some cases, somebody figured out how to keep mothers and babies alive against biological odds that on paper shouldn't have worked. The walk that changed everything. To understand why human birth is so hard, you have to go back roughly 3.6 million years to a patch of drying volcanic ash in what's now Laetoli, Tanzania. Preserved in that ash is a trail of footprints, and if you look closely at the big toe, it's not off to the side gripping like an ape's would. It's tucked in line with the others, built for pushing off the ground in a stride, a human stride. That's the moment our ancestors committed fully to walking upright on 2 legs. It's one of the most important turning points in our evolutionary story, but it came with a hidden cost, and that cost lands squarely on the female pelvis. Walking upright works best with a narrow, compact pelvis. Think of it like a tighter chassis on a sports car, more efficient, less wasted motion with every step. But there's a second evolutionary pressure pulling in the exact opposite direction: bigger brains. And bigger brains need bigger heads to be born through that same narrow frame. That collision, a pelvis built for walking and a skull built for thinking, is the starting gun for one of the most debated puzzles in evolutionary biology. Scientists call it the obstetrical dilemma, and for over 60 years they've been arguing about how our species actually resolved it. But here's the twist: the leading explanation for decades might be missing the real story entirely. 3 scientists, 3 theories, 1 body. In 1960, anthropologist Sherwood Washburn proposed the classic version of this idea. His argument: because the pelvis can only get so wide before walking becomes inefficient, evolution solved the problem by kicking babies out early, before their brains got too big to fit. That's why human infants are born so helpless compared to other primates. A newborn chimp arrives with about 40% of its adult brain size already built. A human baby arrives with only 30%. We are, relatively speaking, born unfinished. This nasal passage is also connected to the mouth. Now, try to relax your tongue and say the word Chi. For decades, that was the textbook answer: tight hips, Big brains, premature birth. Case closed. Then, in 2012, anthropologist Holly Dunsworth and her colleagues published a paper that pulled the rug out from under the whole idea. Their argument wasn't about bone width at all. It was about calories. Pregnancy is expensive. By the third trimester, a mother's body is running at roughly twice her normal resting metabolic rate just to keep the fetus supplied. Dunsworth's team argued that birth doesn't happen because the baby can't fit anymore. It happens because the mother's body hits a metabolic ceiling. She simply can't keep fueling that growth indefinitely without her own system breaking down. Birth, in this view, is less a size limit and more like a phone battery hitting zero. At some point, the system shuts things down whether you're ready or not. That idea got even stranger support a few years later. In 2015, biomechanics researcher Nicole Warrener and her team put women with wider and narrower hips on treadmills and measured their oxygen consumption while walking and running. If the classic theory were right, wider-hipped women should burn noticeably more energy moving around. They didn't. Pelvic width, it turns out, barely affects how efficiently you walk. That finding knocked out one of the central assumptions holding up the original 1960s model. So which theory wins? Honestly, neither won cleanly. This is still an active, sometimes heated scientific argument, and any honest video has to admit that up front. A third group of researchers added yet another layer. Mihaela Pavlich, Philip Mitteroker, and Jonathan Wells pointed out that the female pelvis isn't a fixed shape at all. It actually keeps remodeling itself well after puberty, reshaping under the influence of hormones until it hits peak obstetrical capacity somewhere between ages 25 and 30. And childhood nutrition matters too. A malnourished childhood or a vitamin D deficiency severe enough to cause rickets can permanently stunt how wide that pelvis ever gets, meaning some of the risk in human childbirth isn't really about evolution at all. It's about what happened to that particular mother when she herself was a child. Put it together and you get what Mitteroker calls a cliff edge problem. Evolution wants bigger babies because bigger babies survive infancy better. Evolution also wants a compact pelvis to prevent long-term problems like organ prolapse. Push those two pressures together long enough and you get a small but permanent percentage of pregnancies sitting right on the edge of disaster, no matter how well adapted the species becomes. In other words, some risk in human childbirth isn't a bug that evolution forgot to fix, it's baked into the math. Reading the bones of Delia. Which brings us back to that woman in the Italian cave. Delia, officially Ostuni I, was excavated in 1991 by archaeologist Donato Coppola, and she has become one of the single most important skeletons in the story of ancient childbirth. Later analysis of the fetal remains preserved inside her, done by examining the microscopic growth layers in the developing fetal teeth, placed the pregnancy at roughly 31 to 33 weeks along. Isotopic analysis of her bones suggests she wasn't malnourished or starving. She came from a community that, by Ice Age hunter-gatherer standards, was eating reasonably well. So what killed her? Nobody knows for certain. Researchers have proposed things like severe late pregnancy complications or infection, but there's no definitive diagnosis carved into stone. What we can say with much more confidence is how her community responded. The burial wasn't quick or careless. Someone placed her on her side, curled gently, arm across her abdomen. Someone spent what must have been many hours, possibly days, drilling holes into hundreds of individual sea snail shells to build that ornamented cap. This was roughly 25,000 years before the pyramids, and already human beings were treating the death of a mother and her unborn child as something that demanded ceremony, meaning, grief. That tells us something important that bones alone can't. Childbirth wasn't just a biological event to our ancestors, it was a social one, watched, supported, and mourned by the whole group. Which raises an obvious question. If birth was this dangerous, what were people actually doing to help each other survive it? The first maternity ward. For that, we jump forward roughly 25,000 years to the banks of the Nile. By around 1800 BCE, Egyptian physicians had produced something remarkable, the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, a set of medical fragments dealing specifically with women's reproductive health. A few centuries later came the Ebers Papyrus, an even broader medical text that includes one of the strangest-sounding pregnancy tests you'll ever hear about. Here's how it worked. A woman would urinate daily onto separate batches of barley and emmer wheat seeds. If the barley sprouted, tradition said she was carrying a boy. If the emmer sprouted, a girl. If nothing sprouted at all, she wasn't pregnant. Now, on the surface, that sounds like folk superstition, peeing on grain to divine the sex of your baby. It sounds like something you'd dismiss with a laugh. Except in 1963, researchers actually tested this in a lab, and the results were startling. Urine from non-pregnant women completely blocked the seeds from growing every time, but urine from pregnant women triggered germination in about 70% of the samples tested. The mechanism makes sense once you know the biology. Pregnancy floods the body with elevated hormones, including estrogen and human chorionic gonadotropin, and those compounds appear to stimulate the seed's growth. The sex prediction part didn't hold up scientifically, but the underlying test, it worked. Ancient Egyptian physicians had built a functioning hormone-based pregnancy test using nothing but wheat, barley, and observation, more than 3,000 years before anyone had heard the word hormone. That's not the only piece of ancient reproductive science that holds up. The Kahun Papyrus also describes a contraceptive method, a paste of fermented acacia gum, honey, and natron, inserted before intercourse. Modern chemistry explains why this actually works. As acacia gum ferments, it produces lactic acid, which happens to be an active ingredient in some modern spermicidal gels. Combine that with a thick, sticky barrier of honey, and you've got a rudimentary but genuinely functional contraceptive method, built entirely from tree sap and beehives. So ancient Egyptians weren't just superstitiously guessing about reproduction. They were running something close to controlled experiments, generation after generation, and quietly discovering real biochemistry along the way. But detecting pregnancy and preventing it is one thing. What happened when labor actually went wrong? The surgeon with no scalpel. Fast forward again to the 2nd century AD, and a Greek physician named Cyrannus of Ephesus working between Rome and Alexandria. Cyrannus wrote a text called the Gynækia, essentially the ancient world's most detailed obstetrics manual, and it describes something that might genuinely surprise you, a procedure called podalic version. Here's what that means. If a baby was lying sideways or breech inside the womb, a life-threatening position for a natural delivery, a trained attendant would reach into the birth canal, locate the baby's feet, and manually rotate the fetus into feet first for delivery. No anesthesia, no imaging, just trained hands, careful technique, and an intimate, hard-won knowledge of anatomy passed down through oral and written tradition. Ask yourself, would you have the nerve to attempt that, with nothing but your hands and your training, no monitor telling you what's actually happening inside? Cyrannus also describes the use of a birthing stool, an upright seat with a crescent-shaped opening that let a midwife assist from below while gravity did some of the work, and he documented techniques for repairing tears after birth. This wasn't guesswork, It was accumulated clinical skill, refined and taught over generations. And then, astonishingly, it disappeared. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, so did much of this specialized medical knowledge. Podalic version essentially vanished from European practice for well over 1,000 years, only re-emerging in the 16th century, when physicians rediscovered Soranus's work through translations like Eucharius Roslin's 1513 printed manual, Der Rosengarten, literally the Rose Garden, which brought illustrated fetal positioning diagrams to a new generation of European midwives. Let that sink in for a second. A life-saving obstetric technique existed, was lost, and had to be reinvented from a book. For virtually all of that missing millennium, and honestly for tens of thousands of years before it, women overwhelmingly gave birth upright, squatting, kneeling, sitting on birthing stools or specially fired birthing bricks, like the painted examples excavated at Abydos in Egypt. This wasn't just cultural preference. Radiographic studies confirm that an upright posture can widen the pelvic outlet by as much as 30%, while gravity actively helps guide the baby downward. So why do so many of us picture childbirth happening with the mother lying flat on her back? That image, the lithotomy position, flat on the back, feet in stirrups, is a relatively recent invention. It became standard practice largely in the 17th and 18th century Europe, and one major driver was surprisingly practical. It made it physically easier for male physicians to use a new invention, obstetrical forceps, developed and initially kept secret by the Chamberlain family, to manually extract a baby from an obstructed birth. The position that dominated Western hospital birth for the next 3 centuries wasn't chosen because it was best for the mother's body. It was chosen, in large part, because it made a mechanical tool easier for someone else to operate. Today, modern obstetrics is quietly circling back, increasingly encouraging upright and active birth positions, essentially rediscovering what birthing bricks in Abydos already knew 4,000 years ago. Why you needed a village. There's one more piece to this puzzle, and it might be the most important one. Human babies are usually born facing backward, what's called occiput anterior, meaning the baby emerges facing the same direction as the mother's spine. That sounds like a small anatomical detail, but it has a huge practical consequence. It's very difficult for a mother, alone, to reach down, clear the baby's airway, unwrap a cord, or guide the baby's head upward without straining the infant's neck in an unnatural direction. Chimpanzees can deliver their own babies alone and unassisted. Humans, mechanically, really can't, not easily, and not safely. That single anatomical quirk may be one of the deepest roots of human social behavior. It suggests that natural selection didn't just favor big brains and cooperative hunting. It may have directly favored mothers who sought out help during birth and communities willing to give it. Midwifery, in that light, isn't a cultural nicety invented somewhere along the way. It might be one of the oldest, most fundamental adaptations we have, as biologically essential as the opposable thumb. And it turns out that adaptation still measurably matters today. Modern clinical studies consistently show that continuous, non-medical support during labor from a doula, an experienced companion, someone simply there, is associated with shorter labors, reduced need for pain medication, and fewer emergency interventions. The instinct that made Delia's community carve 600 shells for a woman they lost is the same instinct still quietly operating in maternity wards right now. So here's where all of this leaves us. Human childbirth was never going to be easy, not because evolution made a mistake, but because it was juggling too many things at once: a walking body, a thinking brain, a mother's limited energy, and a species that needed both to survive. Bioarchaeology, ancient papyri, and forgotten Roman medical texts all point to the same underlying truth. Our ancestors didn't out-engineer that problem, they out-cooperated it. Generation after generation, they built knowledge, passed down technique, and simply refused to let anyone go through it alone. Next time you see a woman in a hospital bed with a partner gripping her hand, or a nurse coaching her through a contraction, or even just a friend showing up with food for new parents, you're looking at something genuinely ancient, not a modern courtesy, a direct, living echo of a support system our species has been quietly perfecting since before we could write any of it down. Delia never got to raise her child, but in a strange way, 28,000 years later, she's still teaching us something about what it takes to bring one into the world.